Today we're going to hopefully finish off chapter 3. We are now on paragraph 28. So I shall begin. So far, there is not the slightest reason why I should regard my own thinking from any point of view other than my own. After all, I contemplate the rest of the world by means of thinking. Why should I make my thinking an exception? And the summary for that is, I use my own thinking to study my thoughts. Paragraph 29. I believe I have give sufficient reasons for making thinking the starting point for my study of the world. When Archimedes had discovered the lever, he thought he could lift the whole cosmic from its hinges. If only he could find a point of support for his instrument. He needed something that was supported by itself and by nothing else. In thinking, we have a principle which subsists through itself. Let us try, therefore, to understand the world starting from this basis. We can grasp thinking by means of itself. The question is whether we can also grasp anything else through it. And the summary for that is, thinking exists through itself, so we can start our attempt to understand the world using thinking. Again, what is important, he points out, is that we have a principle which subsists through itself. So thinking can sustain itself. And it supports itself and nothing else. So that's also a good point about thinking. Paragraph 30. I have so far spoken of thinking without taking account of its vehicle, human consciousness. Most present-day philosophers would object that before there can be thinking, there must be consciousness. Hence we ought to start not from thinking, but from consciousness. There is no thinking, they say, without consciousness. To this I must reply that in order to clear up the relation between thinking and consciousness, I must think about it. Hence I presuppose thinking. Nevertheless, one could still argue that although, when the philosopher tries to understand consciousness, he makes use of thinking, and to that extent presupposes it, yet in the ordinary course of life, thinking does arise within consciousness, and therefore presupposes consciousness. Now, if this answer were given to the world creator when he was about to create thinking, it would doubtless be to the point. Naturally, it is not possible to create thinking before consciousness. The philosopher, however, is not concerned with creating the world, but with understanding it. Accordingly, he has to seek the starting points, not for the creation of the world, but for the understanding of it. It seems to me very strange that the philosopher should be reproached for troubling himself first and foremost about the correctness of his principles, instead of turning straight to the objects which he seeks to understand. The world creator had, above all, to know how to find a vehicle for thinking, but the philosopher has to seek a secure foundation for his attempts to understand what already exists. How does it help to start with consciousness and subject to the scrutiny of thinking, if we do not first know whether thinking is in fact able to give us insight into things at all? And the summary for that is, thinking arises with consciousness and therefore presupposes it. Thus, thinking is a secure foundation from which to understand things. So he does point out that thinking, that consciousness is the vehicle of thinking, and people may argue that, we should make consciousness our study, because that you need consciousness first. That's the thing that will help us understand the world. And he's saying, to understand consciousness, you have to think about it, right? So if we think about consciousness, we're thinking about it. So if we're trying to understand the world, we need to start with thinking and not necessarily consciousness. I think you can obviously use thinking to understand consciousness, and he does point out again that if we were creating the world, then yes, we would start with consciousness. But we are concerned about knowledge and understanding the world, so we don't actually need to necessarily know consciousness at this point. And he does see that how would it help us to start with consciousness and subject it to thinking And we haven't even decided if thinking is really something useful as a tool for giving us insight. So those are his points on consciousness and the role it plays. Again, consciousness is the vehicle of thinking. So let's keep that in mind. We'll move on to paragraph 31. We must first consider thinking quite impartially, without reference to a thinking subject or a thought object. For both subject and object are concepts formed by thinking. There is no denying that before anything else can be understood, thinking must also be understood. Whoever denies this fails to realize that man is not the first link in the chain of creation, but the last. Hence, in order to explain the world by means of concepts, we cannot start from the elements of existence which came first in time, but we must begin with that element which is given to us as the nearest and most intimate. We cannot at one bound transport ourselves back to the beginning of the world in order to begin our studies from there, but we must start from the present moment and see whether we can ascend from the latter to the earlier. As long as geology invented fabulous catastrophes to account for the present state of the earth, it groped in darkness. It was only when it began to study the processes at present at work on the earth, and from these to argue back to the past, that it gained a firm foundation. As long as philosophy goes on assuming all sorts of basic principles, such as atom, motion, matter, will, or the unconscious, it will hang in the air. Only if the philosopher recognizes that which is last in time as his first point of attack can he reach his goal. This absolutely last thing at which world evolution has arrived is in fact thinking. And the summary for that is, all explanations of the world through concepts begin with thinking, the nearest and most intimate process achieved by world evolution. And this is actually a good thing to do, because we need to work backwards. A lot of people try and think if we try and go back and study from the very beginning, we can understand things. But sometimes you have to start with what's near to you and start with what facts are given to you in the present moment. And one example I think would be helpful is if you have a goal that you want to achieve, it's actually better to start backwards and have the end result already achieved in your mind, and then ask yourself, okay, how would I get there if I've already attained this? I wouldn't need to know people or this or that, and then so you work backwards, and working backwards is useful. And he says here, the absolutely last thing at which world evolution has arrived is in fact thinking. So he does say thinking is one of the last things to arrive for humans and whatnot. So that's why we should start with thinking as well, because it is given to us as the nearest and most intimate thing that we know. And I'm just going to finish off the next the next paragraph, because we're running out of time. So I'll see you guys later. Bye now.